Hello, guys, and welcome back to the second installment of this series on transcendental arguments. And today we'll be looking at how exactly a transcendental argument for Christianity would proceed and what exactly it would look like in terms of formal considerations. In the first part of this series, I explained why I think a transcendental argument is the best and most powerful argument available to the Christian apologist. I explained that it's the most powerful because, if successful, it establishes the epistemic and rational necessity of Christian theism. That is, one cannot rationally deny Christianity. In the first part, I mentioned that a transcendental argument aims to establish a certain proposition or belief as a necessary precondition for a certain feature or principle of human experience. And I also mentioned that the transcendental argument for Christian theism would aim to show that Christianity is a necessary condition for the intelligibility of human experience. That is, things like logic, knowledge, morality, rationality, etc., would only be possible if Christian theism was, at least implicitly, assumed or presupposed. In general, there are two different strategies that one can use to argue that Christianity is a necessary condition for intelligible human experience. These strategies are, in some sense, interdependent, but in this video, we're only going to consider the first strategy. The second strategy will be addressed in a future video. So the two strategies are: 1. Demonstrating the impossibility of the alternative, and 2. Demonstrating the sufficiency of Christian theism. Let's consider demonstrating the impossibility of the alternative. What this means is that we can establish the necessity of Christian theism for the intelligibility of human experience by demonstrating that the alternatives to Christian theism are all, in some sense, impossible or absurd. We can erect a simple syllogism for this. Premise 1: if the negation of Christian theism is self-defeating, then Christian theism is transcendentally necessary. Premise 2: the negation of Christian theism is self-defeating. Premise 3: therefore, Christian theism is transcendentally necessary. Now, there are two concepts that need to be explained in that argument. The first one is the concept of transcendental necessity. When we say that Christian theism is transcendentally necessary, what that simply means is that it is necessary for intelligible human experience to obtain. More precisely, it is true in all possible worlds in which human intelligible experience obtains. The second concept that requires explanation is the concept of self-defeat. Now, there are various notions of self-defeat available, but in this context, self-defeat implies or refers to self-stultification and performative self-falsification. Self-stultification is when the truth of a certain belief or proposition implies that it is irrational to believe it. Performative self-falsification means that if a belief can be asserted or affirmed, then it is false. The above argument is valid because it is in the form of modus ponens, which is a valid form of argument. So the question arises as to whether or not the argument is sound. And to demonstrate the soundness of the argument, let us first consider the first premise, which states that if the negation of Christian theism is self-defeating, then Christian theism is transcendentally necessary. Why think that this premise is true? Well, we should see that self-defeat, in the sense which we have described above, implies a certain inconsistency between a belief and what we might call the preconditions of intelligible human experience. So, for example, if I were to assert that no human can have any justified belief, the truth of this assertion would imply that I can never be justified or rational in believing it, and so it is self-defeating. What this means is that justification and rationality and knowledge are preconditions of intelligible experience, and the proposition that no human can have justified belief contradicts those preconditions, and that implies its self-defeating nature. And so we can see that self-defeat, in the sense which we described above, implies that a certain proposition is transcendentally impossible. And so the negation of that proposition would have to be transcendentally necessary. And so the first premise has been established. And to demonstrate the soundness of the argument, we would need to defend the second premise, which is the most controversial. And the second premise is called the transcendental premise, and it asserts that the negation of Christian theism is self-defeating. And how do we go ahead to demonstrate that? It is at this point that an objection is usually raised. It has been alleged by multiple opponents of the transcendental argument that it is impossible for the proponent of the argument to adequately shoulder his burden of proof. This is because, in order to defend his second premise, the proponent of the transcendental argument would have to demonstrate the self-defeating nature of a possibly infinite number of alternatives to Christianity. But the proponent of the argument is finite, and as such, he cannot show that all of these alternatives are self-defeating, and hence he cannot shoulder his burden of proof for the second premise. But this objection is predicated on a mistaken assumption. While it is correct that there is a possibly infinite number of philosophical systems which we may rightly characterize as negations of Christian theism, the actual negation of Christian theism is a more generic and primitive philosophical system upon which these particular philosophical systems are predicated. This generic system is made up of general principles which deny central tenets of the Christian worldview. Particular expressions of this generic system flesh out these general principles in a variety of ways. For example, Islam and atheism may, on the surface, seem to be very different philosophical systems. However, on the most fundamental of levels, they are united in their denial of the lordship of Christ. What this implies is that in order to demonstrate the self-defeating nature of the negation of Christian theism, all the proponent of the transcendental argument needs to do is to find a general principle which is able to unite various flavors of unbelief, refute that principle, and show its self-defeating nature. The more general the principle, the more systems he is able to address without examining the particulars of each one. An example of a general principle which unites various forms of unbelieving philosophical systems is the principle of autonomy. Simply speaking, autonomy is the thesis that human life, experience, and knowledge is possible without dependence and reliance upon divine revelation and providence. It is important to note that autonomy is defined with respect to the Christian worldview. That is to say, it is the Christian revelation and the Christian concept of God which autonomy rejects. This implies that so-called religious views are also autonomous views. As such, we can see that there is actually a true dichotomy between Christianity and its alternatives. So once again, thanks for watching. This was the second installment of the series on transcendental arguments, and in the next video, we're going to be taking a look at a practical example of a demonstration of the second premise of this argument. So stay tuned for that, like and subscribe.